Hi, everyone. Is it on? How about now?
All right, how about that?
So we'll find our other panelist in a second. I know he was here. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. My name is Amanda Martin. I'm VP of Enterprise Partnerships at Goodway Group. I head up all our agency level relationships with platforms, data providers, supply, measurement, attribution companies, geolocation companies, and I'm here with Albert.
Okay. I'm Albert Thompson. Ooh, a little too much. Managing Director of Digital at Walton, Isaacson. We're a full service agency, and part of my obviously responsibility is to sort of oversee a lot of the digital technology thinking for our clients. Probably most relevant to the QSR event today is that McDonald's is one of our clients, and I've also previously worked with Burger King.
Great. Well, for everyone's time here, we'll get started and head into the conversation. But obviously, I think probably a good place to start is to talk about where we are with geolocation, kind of where it started, and then where we're kind of moving towards. So if you want to hit it off, I'll back you up on it. Kind of what do we think of as the beginning of a geolocation, and where are we going to see it move in the future?
Sure. I mean, I think, there was all this, in the business, we always have this excitement around new buzzwords, and a few years ago it was geo-fencing, or the whole idea that you didn't have to target an entire DMA or city, but you could get down to more of a block radius level of targeting, based on the simple premise that the average person who walks into your retail location is X miles away. I think this is a formula that's pretty much been crafted, not only from QSRs to big box. I mean, pretty much you name it. Most of these companies are pretty astute in terms of the average travel distance a person will make, to consume their particular product. And that's really kind of where the location targeting started for this particular category, that we can get, minimize the media waste, not speak to people who are sort of out of the zone. Where we've kind of come is that there's this huge explosion around data. In particular, that no one's information is sacred enough. Everything is being sold, and essentially that there are new patterns that you can sort of tap into in understanding consumer behavior. So we've, sort of evolved from the notion of just geofencing to really the idea of device ID tracking, or figuring out where one's cell phone is going, has been, and then starting to understand what the implications are for that around getting and driving inflow into our particular store. So, I mean, kind of in the snapshot, we've, at lightning speed, really come full circle around the idea of sort of the device ID as being sort of the ultimate point of measurability and tracking for consumers now.
And so from my experience, I think we started geolocation as looking at it from a measurement attribution basis. And so it was another way to track an action that you were trying to drive. And I think we've moved away from that as the baseline of what the geolocation data can bring to everyone, and what insights we can get from it, and what can we do with it beyond that. So it's not so much just the check someone walked in the door, which is kind of where it started in the sense from an agency model standpoint. It became a validation of the media effort we were putting out, but it really has transformed into more of a insight generating opportunity for our brands and clients. So do you have any examples of kind of how you see it to dig into the consumer journey and what you can learn from a geolocation provider?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you think about the opportunity, you want to understand traffic flow or foot flow, but you want to understand how people move about the city. What does their journey look like? I think the gentleman from Auntie Anne's was talking about, no one says, let's plan our mall trip around getting a pretzel. You get to the mall and then you see a pretzel stand and you buy. It's the similar understanding of the opportunity of bringing someone in based upon knowing what their proximity is and the patterns of their proximity, and how that then changes the opportunity around trying to sell them and bring them into your store. So when you think about what device ID data can teach you, you can start to understand what the patterns of your consumer is. What is their traffic flow? What is their foot flow? What other retail places do they visit? How does that align to your understanding of who you think they are in terms of the consumer profile? I mean, when you think about it, people are best defined by what they do, in particular where they go and where they spend their money. So when you look at beyond just what geofencing means, that, okay, are they in the perimeter? It's the understanding how they move around your physical location that has everything to do with your ability to attract them and bring them into your location. So I think that's really the beginning of how people start to look at the device ID data is sort of dimensionalizing a consumer profile about what their tendencies are.
So I'm going to let David introduce himself. If we had had geolocation, we could have found you faster.
Yeah, that would have been nice, wouldn't it? My name's David Mahalik. Sorry I'm late.
No, you're not late. You're not
We
late.
started
We're starting early, so we're sorry. We're apologizing to you. You were right on time.
Oh, well, let's go back to the park. It's worse than the 2 o'clock time slot, the early starting 3:15. I have a made-up fancy agency title that's obviously more lofty than my years of experience, but happy to be here today, and we will keep my answers much shorter than Rob's, but otherwise, let's continue.
Okay, great. So we were just diving into kind of how we've expanded past geolocation as a measurement tool or a targeting tool at its basis. Do you want to kind of dive into, as we were preparing for the panel, you spoke about how you see it as a huge opportunity from a consumer insight standpoint, and also from understanding your consumer's journey, and then also the experience. So do you want to dive into that?
Sure. I think it's really interesting doing lots of evaluations of location-based providers. One of the things that they struggle with providing as you guys are vetting these partners is giving you any actual demographic or psychographic data on the device IDs that they've captured at your locations. And I think that's where the power of the marketing stack and the information you guys glean from the apps that you guys create or the partners you work with is incredibly important. The agency I work with, we recently bought Axiom. What's nice about that is you're able to onboard device IDs directly through LiveRamp and match it to Axiom and get over 14,000 attributes of individuals for all the audience segmentation and classification. It sounds like you guys were talking about as I joined. And I think what's powerful there is that you can really start to profile your best customers, which we heard a lot about, and also find out where they're going, what they're doing, and how they're behaving. And that way you can get to a better sense of where to engage those consumers. We have this kind of small office in Birmingham, Michigan, and we have this running joke. Basically, there's one door to go to the city, and if you go out that door, you're going to run right into a Qdoba. And we say, well, if Qdoba could just get more people to go out that door, they're going to get more business. And you guys all know that's not necessarily how it works. So understanding the consumers that Qdoba needs to market to in our office to get us to go out that door and get that true attribution, I think, is where the power comes in. And understanding the key insights, including time, is really important.
Yeah, so you brought up a great point. One of my roles is to vet and determine what vendors we will go with, what geolocation providers, data providers we feel best serve our clients. And the field is muddy, to say the least, and it's crowded. 2 years ago, I was at Ramp Up, and I think I only talked to geolocation vendors. By the end of that conference, I didn't want to hear the word geolocation for a long, long time. So in your experience, I have my ways of determining whose data is good, whose methodology is good, but do you guys want to expand upon how important it is to dig into the data provider you're using? Because there's a lot of misconception out there.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think when you start to sort of break it down, a lot of companies selling stuff out of the same sort of similar media kit. The interesting thing that I think they always take for granted is the average owner-operator, store operator, regardless of category, they have an idea of the feel of foot traffic they get. They know how many people walk in the door. I mean, they can almost break it down to a science because they understand the revenue return models contingent upon how much footfall you get. I think with a lot of these companies is they discount the fact that they know what is a real number and what is not a realistic number. So when you start to get numbers that are 10, 100 times the norm, and sales are not 10, 100 times the norm, then you know that there's a credibility problem in terms of the data. A lot of what we did is we just put them to the test. We ran a campaign based upon what our customers, our clients knew they were getting, and benchmarked to see what the level of accuracy was. And then we sort of went back into the methodology that they had in terms of sort of actualizing what the store traffic looked at. And that was a very quick vetting point of saying, look, these numbers can't even be shared because they're not even believable. They're so off the charts. If this were real, the client would have called me and they'd have been sending us gifts for a week because of how much we had driven revenue through the roof. So I think a lot of it is for us, we just had to get down to executing campaigns and benchmarking against sort of known foot traffic numbers that the operators already have a feel for. It may not be 100% accurate, but they do have an idea within the realm of what is a real number.
So I think I know where you're going to go with this, but so before having to run a campaign, what are I know I have my red flags, but what are some of your thoughts when you're digging into all the numbers? Because it's great. Every sell sheet has a ton of places and a ton of number devices, probably more than physical humans in the United States. And so how do you dig in and find out who actually has a good handle on the data that they have?
Yeah, so what I would say is there's a couple of key areas. The first thing is coverage, is what we looked at. So for all your store locations, are they actually reporting visits to every single location you have? You can provide them the store location and addresses, that's great, but what do they say? Because whatever they say your store location numbers are and your physical locations, they're going to do that same methodology for your competitive set, and that means any kind of data they share with like percent of QSR or percent of traffic for a geolocation is going to be flawed by the same data points that they're flawed when they provide you data. The next thing is you know the number of transactions. I think, Amanda, you said something great. No one walks into a QSR and doesn't buy something for the most part. That's kind of a nice rule of thumb. How does purchases line up both from a daily perspective at a macro level? How does it correlate? How does it trend over time? Is there a strong relationship? And then I think you have to go one step further into precision. When the idea there is go to the individual location, go by the individual day, and see how transactions correlate to those visitations that are being reported. Because all the different ways that vendors are getting through partnership or collecting user behavior and user devices, they're doing a lot of modeling on top of it. It's so hard to pull from these vendors, and some that are on the list of sponsors today, the non-modeled data that's direct, that should have a one-to-one relationship with your visitors and your customers. And too many times we see our clients just trusting, or even our own teams trusting what a vendor says is a degree of accuracy or a degree of success, and it just is so far off. So, coverage, precision, and accuracy are the three ways we typically evaluate vendors.
Yeah, and so I sit a little bit more zoomed out than that to let the vendors even get to the internal team. And so for me, I really look at what unique data set do they have, like what access do they have to data. Oh, it's enlightening. what access did they have to data that their competitors don't have? Because there's a ton of sharing in this space. So all the geolocation providers, for the most part, are selling the data they have to their competitors. It's a very frenemy landscape. And so if you have what everyone else has, what makes you different? What about your methodology makes you different? Is your dwell time methodology, unique enough that it creates a more accurate number? And also, where are you getting the data from? Do you have an SDK in apps? Do you own an app? Or are you using bidstream data, which is usually a huge red flag for me, in the sense that if they're using bidstream data, they should probably be throwing out 85% of it for lack of accuracy. And if they're not, it's a pretty flawed model. You can get some really good insights from bidstream data, but it's extremely difficult. And so for us, we really look at what assets do they own? Do they own apps? Are they in apps? What kind of permissioning do they have? And that's kind of like the first level of conversation that we have.
The other thing I would add is the information meaningful? I mean, a lot of the data they'll share is not actionable. You can't take in a client and pivot. When you start to understand their business model and how they make decisions about their consumer, there's nothing relevant to share. So some of the data we saw was so sort of generic in terms of behaviors and interests. It had nothing to do with the business that they were serving. For us, that was kind of a non-starter. I mean, if you can't take device ID and act on it to pivot, to retool, to optimize marketing plans, even beyond just the media context, there's just not as much value in it. I think a lot of them have believed just because they have troves of information that it's going to be meaningful to the profile of a given company. And the reality is it's not. So a lot of what we start with them is saying, look, this is the type of information that our client essentially can act on. But if you can't provide enhancements to that level of information, then we're just running yet another form of display. Yes, it might be device ID targeted, but it's not going to be a game changer in terms of the business. So I think that's even, if you had to back up to a higher level, the starting point is understanding from the operator, from the retail perspective, what type of information changes things in the context of which they start thinking about their consumer or challenges the preconceived notions that they had about their consumer.
I completely agree. I think at the end of the day, the big difference between like GPS and bid streaming and bid tracking data is the quality, and as Amanda mentioned, the 5 to 15% being the rule of accuracy. The reason is that bid stream data is largely, there's three types. There's the GPS, which we all know and love. The second type is user defined and specified, and if any of you guys have Spotify or Pandora and you've moved anywhere and you've changed your location, and like myself, so I've lived in 6 different cities in 5 years, and Pandora can't find me even though it's directly connected to me all day, every day on the run. So there's inaccuracies with user input data, and then IP addresses is the other big way that bitstream data is coming in, and we all know the challenges of IP address and how frequently it changes, and it doesn't change in some cases. So I think that there are a lot of challenges in the space when it comes to the accuracy and efficacy of the data, and the people that are selling it don't always know. So they lead with beautiful dashboards and some of the great ways that you could potentially use this data, and that unfortunately the accuracy of the data makes it inactionable.
So I think it's key to say that it takes a lot of vetting and digging into the data provider that you're picking. But the alignment of geolocation data and QSR is possibly the best alignment between a vertical and a data set. So by all means, is there a lot to avoid and look through and be accurate about when making a decision? For me, it's feasibility. If I ask 3 data providers if they can do a campaign for me, and one comes back and the other 2 turn the business down, it's probably a pretty good indication that you should question why only 1 of 3 are able to measure what you're asking them to measure. But with that being said, foot traffic into a retail location doesn't necessarily say a purchase happened. But foot traffic into a QSR, to your earlier point, does necessarily mean that they're probably planning to purchase, on their way to purchase, and so the correlation is great. So I think it's worth getting through and finding the right partner, because then you can do really cool, insightful things about it. And so one thing that has been touched upon in some of the earlier presentations is a lot of you own apps, and so you have really valuable first-party data that when synced with geolocation data can really enhance your customer actual experience. So David, do you want to kind of dive into how you see that correlation working out well for brands?
Yes, I think apps are actually really important. I think there's some dissenting points of view that maybe apps aren't the way that you should necessarily go. I think if you have a purpose and you can give a reason to download your app and keep it relevant, Starbucks and the rewards, etc., I think it's all really meaningful and impactful. I think what we were talking about is if I go on my phone, and Panera is terrible at this, so I'm going to pick on them because they're not here. But if I order on my phone, and every time it's always 10 minutes, my order is always ready in 10 minutes. I don't care what time of day it is. I walk into the store, and it's absolutely not ready. And immediately I start the loss aversion. Did they get my order? Did I order in a different state? Did I order the wrong thing? Did someone pick it up? Did someone steal it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, just improve the relationship there with me, Panera, just a little bit, because you're killing me. I like QSR, it's obvious. So help me get my food faster and more accurate. So one of the things we were talking about is when I get 5 minutes away from the store and I enter the geo-fence, don't hit me with marketing, hit me with a message saying my order is being started. Hit me with the communication like, hey, the food prep team, they just entered into the radius that based on Waze or other mapping system says they're going to get to the restaurant in 5 minutes. Let's start preparing the order so it's fresh and hot. And that's the kind of experience I'm willing to trade my personal information for, that enriches my experience, that makes me want to download your apps, and that makes me want to have a better relationship with your brand.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think it's thinking about the dimensionalizing the relationship, similar to those of you who have, like I do, teenagers. When you give them their first cell phone, you give it to them as a tracking device. You just want to know where they are at all times. It's not so much they can call their friends or even call you, but at some point it expands, meaning it becomes a mobile wallet. You may use Cash App, some other app. Some of the means of giving them digital currency instead of giving them cash, so that they can use the phone to then transact, and you can make deposits while they are out and about. So it moves beyond just where they are to facilitating things that don't require such a heavy hand for you as a parent. You got to think about it the same way in terms of building the business model around mobile for a customer base, not just to ping them with coupons, but to extend value essentially beyond. If you're a QSR and you sponsor concerts, because a lot of them do, then you start to move into what is the entertainment, what are the bennies that I get in terms of this relationship beyond just food and getting my order on time. I think some of that is just the not using it as an inflection point to speak with them, engage them, to court them against all the sort of marketing elements on the continuum that you do that would be of interest to them. I think that's kind of where it falls short in terms of people not planning for an extensive relationship through a point of reference being something as basic as an app. I think when voice starts to usher in, people are going to have to really start to think about what the conversation should be between the QSR and the consumer when the consumer wants to talk at them and not tap at them. But I think a lot of it just starts with basic planning of thinking about the expansive view of what the relationship would be. I mean, at the end of the day, if the key is retention and loyalty, what is it going to take to retain a 5, 10, 20-year relationship when you consider the amount of competitive influx just to the culinary scene as it is, especially when we look at major markets like a New York City or San Francisco versus, the options of what you eat in a rural town. There's just a different strategy that has to be employed that's just going to be necessary to keep them.
So I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the asset that geolocation data gives you from a competitive standpoint. The amount of information you can learn about your consumer and where else they go, what other brands are they consuming, and what insights you can derive from that. You guys had any experience kind of taking it less from a measurement, attribution, campaign angle, and more from insights and, to your point, adding on additional data points?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we actually did it outside of QSR. We did it with our automotive client. Clients are sometimes torn between who they think they are and how a customer sees them. And we actually wanted to understand the dealership competitive journey for that our particular client. We wanted to know where they were going before they came to their dealership and after. And if you were to ask the client, they would have made assumptions around BMW, Mercedes, Land Rover. But really, when we looked at the journey of their buyer, it was Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Chevy, Ford. The reality is the consumer type they have, where they make their money, is different from how they project themselves. That's very key. Just because you make assumptions as marketers, this is your profile. Look, if you want to understand who you're dealing with, you got to map all the places that they go. And they would have probably said, well, our customer is a Target customer. We'd be like, no, it's actually a Walmart one, actually. But when you think about that, when you start to look at physical behaviors in their journey, that tells you everything about where they really are. Their buying behaviors, what they're willing to spend, sometimes their attitudes about the category. So if you're a QSR, are you the only QSR in the journey? If you're a burger company, or are they burger hopping and you just happen to be the one they selected because the convenience of the journey or route to wherever they were going. So it's not only about the flow that comes to your store, it's about where do they essentially go next. The other thing is, if you're trying to route them in, you have to know point of reference of where they're coming from and where they're headed to. It has everything to do with the ability to get them to repeatedly make that stop. Is it that you're on the way home? Is it that they stop because you're part of some leisure journey that only happens on the weekend? When you think about airlines, when they expand, they monitor air traffic control patterns. They look at congestion points, pain points, and then they start a new location based on something that's getting over-trafficked by humans, but there's just not enough planes. QSRs can do the same thing. You can look at it from an expansion opportunity, but it's really the device ID journey that starts to map, almost like from a cityscape perspective, how people move in and out and how you can move them into your retail operation. I think that's going to be very much sort of the next frontier in terms of looking at device ID data, not so much around behaviors to your store, but from a competitive footprint. I mean, who you compete with financially, what are the behaviors and tendencies of your consumer around those stores as well?
I would say that the presentation that we saw earlier in the day with ThinkNear's got it, spot on. This idea of figure out where your actual customers are, figure out who they are, and then start looking for like customers as they go to your competitors and target them. I think it's really impactful to be able to map the super burger lover versus the frequent coffee drinker and break out those subcategories. And you get that information by checking out where those competitors or where those visitors are going and how frequently are they going and how often do you see those devices going to specific locations. I would say the watch out, because the presentation earlier was right in line with the way we think about targeting those consumers outside of what you think or where you think people are, is just don't get in the way of the impact of a conversion that's already going to happen and put all your money there. It's one of the reasons why every time I stop at a gas station off the exit of a highway, I get hammered with QSR ads at a gas station TV. If I'm going to the QSR off that exit, it's not because of the gas station TV. It may be because the sign up the road enticed my decision making along the way, and I've likely already made the decision on where to go. Now, you guys can probably argue that we should do some tests. I'm willing to help you set up those tests from a customization standpoint, but at the end of the day, you be careful on where you attribute those customers and those impacts.
I think the other thing to add to your point, because you're talking about where the device IDs go, is the gentleman for Auntie Anne's was talking about the importance of influencers and micro influencers. The micro influencer spectrum is going to, in the near future, have a geolocation sort of orientation. It's going to be around proximity to a particular store, storefront, or stores in a market. You can see certain companies that are already playing around more or less on the IBM Watson side with the idea of an influencer in their following. Did they drive store attribution? Did they get the people who engage with the influencer campaign to go to that particular store, particular storefront? And that's kind of really the sort of the next layer in terms of moving beyond just core consumers, that if you employ an influencer strategy, to what degree that individual's got people to go and cash in and take advantage of the opportunity or the sale or the promotion. And then to a degree that attribution essentially can be tied. And I think that becomes the upshot not only for the influencer strategy, but starts to move the sort of location conversation to a new spectrum beyond just the idea of, from a programmatic perspective, can we target people, but to what degree can we leverage people to get more people to essentially come into the storefront?
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open up for some Q&A. But are there things that you wish you could do with geolocation that you can't currently do with geolocation, but you think are in the realm of possibilities in the close to near future?
So I think we kind of talked about this idea of holdout groups, and while we can do holdout groups, but they're in incredibly expensive right now to run any kind of closed loop analysis on QSR. I think it's the ability to provide that type of data to our clients nimbly and quickly and be able to control for that as a way to prove out the efficacy of the marketing campaigns, I think is incredibly important. So we're inching closer to that. I think it's a near-term roadmap as a part of the service offerings companies like Google does, and I think Google's location-based measurement product is amazing. I mean, they have 5 apps with over 1 billion users. Go Google, but you suck at a bunch of other things like not providing baselines or incrementality or attribution at large scale. We talked about earlier today, like YouTube, yes, it can drive visitation, but what are you double counting all of your store visits because you're running a display ad and a YouTube campaign? So I think attribution and that closed loop analysis is really close, and I would say, in a year or two, but that's what I'm looking out for.
I'm really glad your Go Google kind of took a little bit of a side path there, because I was gonna have to come down on you on that front. One thing that I would say on the geolocation front is I really am one for third-party measurement in the sense of not letting your vendors grade their own homework, and I think that's a key piece in this, is that if they're running the media for you or executing the media for you and they're telling you how well it did, it's potentially a conflict of interest, especially when they don't, lift up the lid and let you look at the hood and let you look inside. So that's my one Google plug there. But Albert, what about for you?
I think it's it's kind of a double-edged sword to comes with it. A closer tied to sales impact, sales lift. I mean, I think there's no brand that's not asking that question. I think what we look at it as a leading indicator, a strongest measure of intent. I mean, someone who's most willing to buy is the one who shows up. So we don't run hard and fast with the numbers, but we know that's where it's going. We get a lot of questions from, hey, can we tie the device ID to somebody who just bought something? It's like, no, because it's a device ID, not the cell phone number you have access to. There are a few trade organizations that keep that in tow. But I think that's going to be is how can we get a little bit closer to attributing the understanding. What we've been able to correlate is between the amount of footfall and the average number of sales that take place, kind of to a ratio to say, one out of every 4, and this is not necessarily in the QSR category, but 1 out of every X essentially buys. That kind of gets us good enough, but you can see clients start to lean in to rely heavier on looking at footfall to make decisions about what's driving store traffic, because we tell them all the time, let's run what gets them there. You can sell them whatever you want. Not be so focused on just what you want to sell. Promote what drives the football behavior, because once they're there, they're not going to waste their time. They're going to look to engage and transact into something. But I think it would be getting into that a tighter measure into sales lift, sales attribution to some degree, so that you can get them to double down into the tactic. It's hard to get them to wean off the things they've been most comfortable with that have no attribution. Because they just expect, well, if we're going to do more of this, it has to have even better attribution. So we'll see how things evolve over the coming years. But I think that's probably the main sort of chicken and egg we're faced with in terms of clients wanting that last mile of information to connect with who they transact with on a daily basis.
Great. Any questions?
Any questions? It's always the farthest person. We'll be right down.
Hey, thanks, guys. Will Center here from USIM. Just curious, you were talking about the importance of having that third-party verification, and then also kind of talking through some of your methodology for your analysis, and evaluating the efficacy of some of those results that you're seeing through location verification. Love where it's headed from like a human geography standpoint, and I could geek out on that all day, but I'm going to focus on the strictly media and KPI location verification, tying that back to use device IDs that have been exposed to messaging from our brands. So is there a particular vendor in that third-party space? I've had some issues evaluating, I think, some really inflated numbers partners that'll go unnamed, like Facebook. But are there partners that are impressing you with, when you're doing those back checks to like tying into that individual store by store, franchise by franchise, or like regional visitation numbers? Are there people that have impressed you with their accuracy?
No, unfortunately. It's usually so some of the correlations that we're seeing are moderate to fair, so think of like 0.6, 0.7 at the individual store level. And then when you talk about scalability, you're looking at 20 to 30 X in terms of factorial that you have to apply to the base level numbers. And then when you think about the data of asking them, so one of the gotcha moments for a lot of these companies is asking them to do a projection on your sales. And so if they know demographics about their data, psychographics about their data, and they have confidence in the accuracy of their data, they should be able to get pretty close to your actual numbers of sales per day. But what we find, and people were beating on Nielsen earlier, I could beat on them too, but one of the things that makes Nielsen really nice is they actually have a representative sample of the populace for the most part, and they are able to factor up and scale their data sets. What I find is a lot of location-based vendors can't do that, or can't do it well enough to get a reasonable degree of accuracy. So far, I would say no.
For me, I'd say we have, but it's companies that have built it core in their tech stack. So when you talk about a DSP layering on through a partner that ends up being panel-based representation, that's where you really get the inflated numbers, because it is a panel-based representation, and the methodology is just not accurate to actual information. When you find a company, we have 3 that we've actually worked with, and look, we burned through a lot over the last half a decade. We met with companies that built it into the tech stack. They spent $2, $3, $4, $5 million to get it integrated, and then we tested. And then sometimes the data wasn't accurate. We tested again, ran it again, and got to a point where felt comfortable with the numbers. But we had them retool. We ended up having what I'd call engineering conversations with the DSP, meaning I didn't talk to the salespeople. I talked to people who built it, and that's what you really have to do, because you have to understand they may not have built the stack for your client's business model or your own business model. So that is where you got to fact check. No one says, "Oh, we built a geolocation platform for Target in that volume customer base versus Walmart versus QSR versus an automotive dealership." But you really have to kind of put them to the test, and you really have to be clear about what the norms are up front as a baseline. So I don't want to use the forum as shameless plugs, but I'd be happy to talk to you when I get off and sort of name drop a few companies that we've worked with, that we've been confident with over the years. And look, we look at the numbers every report, and there are times when the numbers are off. They go back, they rerun them, and they fix them, just because of how the platform calculated was inaccurate. Look, it's all man-made, so there are errors that are made. But we're really diligent about looking at it every single month for the several years straight that we've been doing it. You have to be that diligent, just because they don't really know. So part of it is the idea of keeping them honest.
Yeah, I would say that there's not a one size fits all. There's not this person hits the nail on the head. But I do feel like different providers have different strength points, and then you align that strength point with your client's objective. And so while someone might, not have the scale that you would love them to have, they have an accuracy on dwell time that nobody else has. And so if that's what your client cares about, is how long someone's staying in the location, then that's probably the best provider. But there's definitely not a one size fits all. And I think it's unfortunately the revisitation, because the tech changes so much and the access to the data changes, and I think the privacy changes that are coming our way in the US that have already happened in the EU are going to impact a ton of the providers who don't actually own the consent mechanism. So it's a consistent reel of gut checking. And then also to Albert's point, they don't know that they're not right unless you're truth setting it.
Yeah, the last thing I will say is if you're using your phone as your primary location device for QSR, I personally think you could do something better. 70% of most QSRs drive-through based, right? So the autos are all eager and willing to sell you location-based data. They have it at their fingertips. Your consumers are there, and you can really get some interesting data points from those autos.
Other questions?
Thanks, guys.
There's a question over here somewhere. There it is.
So I'll ask it. I think it's still in the same vein. So I'm Harrison from Think Here, and happy to hear that
You said that
We've made a conscious decision to not offer attribution as a way of simply what you said, not grading our own homework. That being said, I think that there still doesn't seem to be a definitive sort of route to go to in terms of, all right, well, there's the issue with panel that isn't necessarily accurate. But then if we talk about impression based, then we're talking about bid stream data, and that's not accurate. So is there something out there that you guys have heard that is somewhere in between that could be a new solution? Because it doesn't seem like you have a preference or believe in one methodology or the other, unless there's something that I'm not thinking of.
I mean, I have a preference. What I would be giving away, what I would say is a shameless plug to a partner. But basically, at the end of the day, what I think we talked about, if you're working with a partner that has an app, say WeatherBug or something like that, or you're working with, Google and Google Maps and Waze, I mean, you're going to get some of the best data that you possibly can get. And where you guys are streaming your data from, it looked like some partnerships with automotives and some GPS location-based providers. I think that if you can focus heavily on GPS, you're going to win out over bitstream data. But I know a lot of partners will come in and say, well, we use machine learning against location bitstream data, and we're farming out the best quality data. At the end of the day, everyone should make their own decision based on their sales and do the analysis themselves. It's merely a warning that if you believe everything the sales rep is telling you, you're probably in a bad situation.
Yeah, I think it's just that you can't take it at face value because it's such a crowded market, and there are so many offerings that are just based on other people's data. So they don't actually have any tech that they're applying to the data. They're just buying it and aggregating it and then pushing it out, to the brands. And so I think that's kind of where the warning is. It's not that there aren't good solutions out there. It's that there are a lot of not great solutions out there. So you have to avoid them. Perfect. Thank you guys so much.
Great job. Thank you, Amanda. Great ending to a really strong day.